I don't know if you've all heard the phrase the fourth industrial revolution, but there's kind of this growing idea out there about kind of the hyper-connectivity, the intelligence behind the connectivity, and what that's doing to change actually in very fundamental ways the way the world works, similarly to the way previous industrial revolutions have transformed people's lives as well as commerce. And for us, what we've kind of identified, and I really have to give Yuval Tal, the founder of Payoneer, a lot of credit. I mean, Yuval, truly was visionary. He saw a lot of these trends, 13, 14 years ago when he founded Payoneer, right? So there are kind of four mega trends that we've paid attention to and that have really informed our worldview. So one is that with technology and the internet, right, borders come down. Right, the friction that used to stand in the way of people and businesses in different places around the world communicating, interacting, transacting are all eroding, in some cases extremely quickly, and you're left with a world that actually has far more ability to interact, communicate, and transact than ever before. Second, and somewhat related to that, is that parts of the world that used to be very disconnected, very far apart, not just geographically, but in the way they were able to communicate, interact, and transact, now it's kind of like they're all on the same operating system for the first time, right? So kind of think about it as it's like there's an iPhone layer now sitting on top of the entire world that every country is now part of, right? It's kind of this layer that sits on top of whatever legacy infrastructure was there that all of a sudden has created this interoperable environment that everybody can play in. And so not only is the friction that stood in the way across borders coming down, everybody is truly, whether you're in the emerging markets, developed world, west or the east, you're now essentially operating in an environment where you're all connected together in many ways for the first time. A third, and again, kind of powerful and transformational trend that we see is kind of the democratization of access and opportunity. And kind of one of the fundamental ideas here is that the gap between talent and market has never been smaller. It doesn't matter now where you are in the world, and it doesn't matter how small you are. If you are an individual, a small business owner, if you have something of value that you can create, whether it's an idea, whether it's a service you can provide, whether it's a good that you can create, if you have something of value that is unique and different that anyone in the world can find value in, you now actually have a path to market that never existed before. And part of the reason for that is, again, in this kind of global, interconnected, technology-driven world that we live in, there's the emergence of new marketplaces and platforms, kind of these new commercial intermediaries for the digital world, right? So these are the new matchmakers of buyers and sellers. These are the new pathways to access unlimited supply and unlimited demand all over the world. And these really are redrawing supply chains and redrawing the way products and services go to market and redrawing the way people engage and buy. And so at the end of the day, what we see happening with all of that is this kind of massive empowerment, again, democratization of access and opportunity, and in many ways that's what technology does kind of across almost everything it touches. And so again, this borderless, interconnected world creating opportunity for people and small businesses. It's important to really understand whatever your idea is, whatever your business is, whatever you're doing, it's important to understand the difference between whether you're part of a revolution or whether you're part of an evolution. So I was just in Korea, right, and it was really interesting. The people in Korea were so jealous of the mobile payment system in China. Like you could feel it when you're talking to them. They felt so inadequate that China was so far ahead of them. And they were asking, why is China so far ahead of us in mobile payments? Right? China was ahead of Korea in mobile payments because as e-commerce developed in China, the infrastructure that could support people buying online sucked. It didn't really work. And so Alibaba, who wanted to sell stuff to all these people that wanted to buy, had a problem to solve, and they created a payment system to address that. Korea, everybody had credit cards. Credit cards worked online just fine, and it worked just fine plugged into whatever mobile phone you were trying to buy from and buy through. So the friction that existed in the case of Alibaba in China didn't exist in the case of Korea. So you could be just as brilliant a person sitting in Korea as the person who was sitting in China and came up with the idea of building a mobile payment system. And you could have done just as brilliant a job in Korea as the person had done in China designing and building Alipay. You would have had radically different outcomes because in one case you were creating an incrementally better solution than something that worked just fine. And in the other case, you were solving a fundamental problem that was standing in the way of people participating in a revolutionary change that existed around them. eBay and PayPal is another good example. PayPal exists today because eBay existed. And eBay fundamentally democratized access to becoming an online merchant for any individual in the United States at the time that wanted to sell something. The problem is you couldn't get paid, right? Nobody would give you a merchant account online to get paid by credit card. But PayPal actually had a system that essentially solved that problem. So PayPal grew because people wanted to sell online through eBay and they needed a way to get paid. And part of what excited me about Payoneer before I joined, after I joined, and part of what has benefited us all along the way is that we didn't have to do anything revolutionary. The revolution that was happening was that there were digital marketplaces and platforms all over the world that were creating new opportunities for people and small businesses all over the world to sell things all over the world. And that created a whole bunch of payment friction. And we were, not that I was part of it, we were smart enough and also lucky enough to actually have been at the right place at the right time with something that actually solved a fundamental problem that stood between people and their ability to actually participate in that revolutionary change. So it's really, really important to be clear-headed and clear-eyed about what you're trying to accomplish, because if you're trying to make something incrementally better, your customer acquisition costs, your time to critical mass, and ultimately the likelihood of success are all going to be radically different than if you're participating in some change that's bigger than whatever it is that you're creating. The trust in people that you know, people that are like you, people that you can kind of actually relate to in some way, actually seems to be more powerful than ever, and in some ways it actually seems to be the primary way people are actually navigating their way through all the noise that exists. And so, again, not surprisingly, reputation, the recommendation of others, referrals become an incredibly powerful way to build trust. And actually, along with that, what we have found that in the online world, if you have some people that trust you, you can build a brand and build trust with others very quickly. Again, I mean, I find it shocking to me. I mean, as Payoneer, and again, we're now 13 plus years old, but at any given point in time, we have about $1 billion of customer money entrusted to us, right? And very few of those people that entrust us with that money have ever sat across a table from any of us, right? So again, we've been around for a while, but again, there were some things along the way that helped early on, right? Our brand sat next to the brand of a marketplace that chose us. So if you were someone working with a marketplace, kind of like, all right, that marketplace probably is smart and they probably figured something out. And at the early days, our brand was next to MasterCard, which I think also helped. But after that, it's really been based on referrals. And again, the next thing that you have to take away from it is you can lose trust really, really, really fast, right? So these days, the time it takes to go from being trusted to being essentially, irrelevant and untrusted can be a matter of minutes, and that can be cyber, can be bad policies and bad decisions. It can be something that suddenly doesn't seem transparent and is opaque, or whatever it may be. But understand that you're in the trust business and it's fragile. We started to see kind of the pendulum swing back away from the borderless world and the frictionless world probably 3 years ago or so. We started to see patterns emerging around the world with regulators and government authorities starting to try to kind of reassert their control over what felt like a completely uncontrolled change in how the world was working around them. And there were a few kind of recurring themes. So what you start to see is privacy is actually now one of the top things that almost any government now feels that they have both an obligation and a right to protect the privacy of the citizens in their country. Probably not shocking to anybody, taxes. And we're still early days in what we think is, again, kind of a decade or a couple of decades of evolution and change in the way governments think about the notion of jurisdiction and how to tax activity. Consumer protection and safety of funds, obviously anti-money laundering controls, ability to implement monetary policy and not lose control, and cybersecurity. So again, all things that we see emerging as important and where different countries in different places around the world actually can take different approaches. There's a big difference between being global and being local everywhere. For most of our history, we actually were global but not really local anywhere. But as you really start to get into it more, you really start to understand just how significant the differences are in different places. And again, it can even be, boy, if you want to interact with almost anybody in China and your platform isn't going to communicate in some way through WeChat, you're probably going to have some problems, right? So again, there's so many kind of mundane, basic things before you even get to all the regulatory challenges and things like that that come along with being more local in different markets. In FinTech, what we found is, again, kind of systematically, there is an overemphasis on the tech and an underemphasis on the financial part. And it's not surprising, right? Because, where is innovation going to come from? Where is digital disruption going to come from? It's far more likely to come from people coming out of the tech industry than it is for people coming out of financial services and kind of more traditional and legacy players. But at the end of the day, right, you are in some way, shape, or form in the financial services space. And in some way, shape, or form, you are going to have to touch important things like the protection of money, protection of data, regulatory compliance, other kinds of issues that are just fundamentally different than what most tech companies have to deal with. These are things that are really, really, really important lessons to learn before as much as possible, because the penalties for non-compliance is really too high. Our first step in terms of physically starting to localize, so we had done localizing of language and things like that, but the first step in terms of physically localizing was actually arranging for us to have brand ambassadors in countries around the world. And think of them as these were kind of like super customers for us. Like, they were good customers, they'd been with us for a while, and they were folks that we thought others in the market would aspire to be like. And so we brought them on and asked them to essentially help us voice of Payoneer to the market, voice of the market to Payoneer, and help us to kind of do a bit more locally. We then went to California and China, which California, Silicon Valley being a very important market for us with marketplaces and platforms, and China actually being a very important market for us in terms of sellers that were selling goods around the world. For us, where things started, again, it really was, we started with enterprise clients that would wire us money in bulk. They would send us instructions through an API, and they'd actually make payments to a prepaid debit card on the other side. And for almost half of the company's existence, that's basically what we did. And so over the years, basically what we've been doing is kind of, again, putting one foot in front of the other, listening to the opportunities our customers were trying to pursue, the friction that they felt, and trying to figure out ways to address that and solve for that. And so step by step, we've been able to leverage that into a pretty amazing global infrastructure. We would not have been able to build relationships with all these global banks if we hadn't already established relationships with the marketplaces and platforms, gotten volume and flow, learned how to do KYC, which got us the ability to actually go explain to a regulator what we were doing, get licensed, and things like that. We have two main types of customers. One is we work with lots of marketplaces and platforms, and I kind of implied that in the the beginning when I talked about some of the disruptive change happening in the world and really how we've benefited by not having to be all that brilliant. We actually opened up our platform, we created a product, and all of a sudden folks that were selling on Airbnb started to use us to get paid from Airbnb. We didn't do anything brilliant there. We were smart enough to open it up and do it in a compliant way, which wasn't that easy to do. And then we had people that were smart enough to recognize that Airbnb was making payments through us and realized that it probably meant they had a payment problem. And so we went to Airbnb and said, we think you have a payment problem, and they said, you're right. And that was the beginning of a relationship that has continued to grow, develop, and evolve over time as we've helped them solve their problems and challenges of being, again, a hyper-global, frictionless business. Other set of customers is SMEs, and so we work with SMEs and professionals all over the world, and this is actually what gets us most excited, right? So this is where we really feel the impact that we are having on real people and their lives, their ability to generate more jobs in their home market, more income, more of a legacy for their family, and it's something that we are super excited about. When we first started with those brand ambassadors, we created a new engagement model. Again, we kind of recognized that we were in the empowerment business, not in the payment business. We recognized that we were there to help people participate in this new frictionless digital global economy where there were more opportunities regardless of where you came from, regardless of how small you were. But they needed help, they needed partners, they needed someone who could actually help them navigate that. And so we started with these events. And so, again, we hosted the first e-commerce event in Delhi. There were something like 600 or 700 merchants and manufacturers that came. We brought partners, we brought like Etsy from the US, hosted a VIP dinner with them and a bunch of manufacturers who were all trying to figure out, how do I get into the US market and what can you do for me? And Etsy's trying to figure out, what can I source from India? We had Amazon speak, we had banks that were there, Citi was there speaking, we had government officials, we had tax advisors, we had marketing companies. It's like an 8-hour event that people came. It wasn't a Payoneer commercial, it wasn't about payments, right? It was about the world is changing and what can I do to participate in it. And we host events like that, again, all over the world, whether it be in Kiev, Tokyo, and Islamabad. And again, fundamentally, it's because we believe that, in this new digital world, there's kind of this whole new generation of businesses that are emerging that we really feel a responsibility to help them grow. And we believe as they grow and as we continue to help them solve their problems and capture the opportunities that are out there, that will grow with them. I wouldn't start the Payoneer business model from scratch, right? So if, I'm kind of a business model junkie, if someone came to me with, written out on a piece of paper, I want to start the Payoneer business model, I would, and Payoneer didn't exist, I would think it was crazy, and I would not pursue it. And the reason is that, again, we didn't get here by being brilliant. Yuval had a brilliant insight at the beginning, and then I think we were a little good and a fair amount lucky, and then we had a bunch of people that were smart enough and good enough to understand that and understand how to actually make some good decisions after it to kind of keep it going. And so it took us working with oDesk as a marketplace in order to realize that there were actually going to be freelancers in crazy places around the world like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Ukraine, Argentina, and stuff like that. We didn't set out to build a business in those markets. We set out to help oDesk make some payments. I don't think oDesk had an idea that their marketplace was going to be that global. They just had some payment problems, and they all of a sudden had people all over the place. So, and we stuck the Payoneer brand on the product. And so when that freelancer in Bangladesh and Pakistan decided to use Payoneer to get paid, and it wasn't because it was the best option, it was really the only way for them to get paid if they wanted to participate on oDesk. They weren't just selling on oDesk, they were selling on Elance. So they got in touch with Elance and said, hey Elance, can you add Payoneer? And they knew Payoneer existed because we were lucky enough, again, I don't think smart enough, lucky enough to put the brand Payoneer on there. So they actually knew they were working with Payoneer. So then they asked Elance. That then brought more service providers in more places, kind of the beginnings of these network effects. And our business has been kind of this growth of network effects over time. And we've cultivated it. But really, again, there was nothing that we could have done to replace that starting point. And so along the way, we cultivate these kind of layers of value, each one of which really, again, took what came before. So the brand really started to develop because we worked with brands that other people were working with and trusted, and then we've, again, done a lot to protect it, nurture it, and cultivate it. Those network effects, we couldn't have started those network effects if there weren't networks out of activity that we were lucky enough to stumble our way into. But again, we've cultivated that. After we did that, wow, we knew how to do KYC on people in random places around the world that no one else knew how to do, and we had a critical mass of it. That built a really, really unique KYC infrastructure that nobody else has really had, and so we've been able to leverage that. And we've leveraged that in regulatory environments and with our banking partners. Because we had customers and had volume, we were able to not just get banks to work with us, we were able to actually get pretty attractive pricing with banks. And that makes a difference if you're going and trying to sell a company like Airbnb on payment flow. You know, they don't just want to know that you have coverage, they actually care about how much it costs. And you can't get low prices if you don't have the flow. We couldn't have gotten the flow if we hadn't done the prepaid card first and gotten the other stuff.